Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. President Trump is drawing scrutiny from both sides of the aisle after firing two inspectors general in recent days. Michael Atkinson was removed last Friday. He was the watchdog for the intelligence community. Atkinson was the person who alerted Congress to the whistleblower complaint that sparked the impeachment inquiry into President Trump. In his resignation letter, Atkinson said in part, quote, "It is hard not to think that the president's loss of confidence in me derives from my having faithfully discharged my legal obligations as an independent and impartial inspector general." Then, this Monday, President Trump also removed Acting Inspector General Glenn Fine. The Pentagon official was appointed to monitor the more than $2 trillion coronavirus stimulus package. Kim Wehle is a CBS News legal analyst and former U.S. attorney, and she joins me now from Maryland. Kim, it is really great to see you. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Elaine. Happy to be here.
So over the weekend, President Trump was asked why he decided to fire Michael Atkinson. Let's go ahead and listen to his response.
I thought he did a terrible job, absolutely terrible. He took a whistleblower report, which turned out to be a fake report. It was fake. It was totally wrong. It was about my conversation with the president of Ukraine. He took a fake report and he brought it to Congress with an emergency, okay? Not a big Trump fan, that I can tell you.
So, Kim, what is your assessment of that response?
I think he's being very honest with the reasons why he fired Mr. Atkinson. He's not a big Trump fan, and that's really a problem structurally because the inspectors general, there are approximately 73 across the federal government, were put in place largely after Watergate to ensure that there was some independent oversight of the executive branch, and they have a lot of authority to neutrally evaluate what's happening so that American taxpayer dollars aren't put towards fraudulent, abusive tasks. And in this instance, there's no allegation from Mr. Trump from his letter explaining why Mr. Atkinson was fired, nothing that goes to him not performing his job dutifully for the American people, which is an independent watchdog, which includes passing along whistleblower information. The reason it looks like he was fired was because he was disloyal to the president himself. And that sets a very bad precedent for oversight and accountability for the office of the presidency and the executive branch in general moving forward.
Just to follow up, Kim, some people might say, well, it is within the president's power to remove an inspector general. However, you're saying it sounded like a lot of the underlying kind of conditions that would normally exist when a president takes this kind of action just didn't. Did the president follow protocol in this instance?
So the inspector general's statutes can vary in terms of the bases for removing someone from that position, just like other positions in the government. We saw this with Robert Mueller. In certain circumstances, the president's ability to fire people is limited to what's known as for cause. For this particular instance, what the statute requires the president to do is give the Congress 30 days notice, and in that notice, explain the basis for the removal. And I think the assumption in the statute is that the basis for removal will be tied to some malfeasance in office, something that is essentially not doing the job description that Congress gave Mr. Atkinson to do. Here, the notice did not include any substantive critique of the work he was doing, number one. And number two, at the time that he gave notice that Mr. Atkinson was going to be removed, it technically gave the 30-day period, but then it put him on immediate administrative leave. So the theory behind the 30 days was that that person could wrap up their job, their independent oversight job, hand the baton on to someone else while not necessarily within the control of the president. In this instance, I think the argument is that in putting him on immediate administrative leave, the president got a little bit cute, so to speak, in basically getting around the 30-day notice period, in addition to not really giving any good reason. And the president, again, was quite honest in his remarks afterwards, the reason was he wants people that are loyal to him personally. And the problem with that is loyalty to a man personally doesn't necessarily give rise to independent, thoughtful oversight, which of course is what Mr. Atkinson did in passing along the whistleblower complaint to the United States Congress that gave rise to the impeachment inquiry. And in terms of it being a fake report, the American people can decide on their own, having watched the testimony in the House impeachment proceedings from career officials that basically talked about what actually did happen. And of course, Mr. Trump was acquitted, but there were some serious concerns that there were issues that weren't necessarily good for the rule of law in that whole narrative.
So, Kim, given what you just laid out, more broadly, what has been the reaction from lawmakers, particularly Republicans, to the removal of these inspectors general?
Well, I think most remarkably, Susan Collins, who I think somewhat famously, when she voted to acquit the president of abuse of office, said, I believe he will have learned his lesson, or impeachment is a big lesson. And she came out and essentially said, this isn't a good reason to fire an inspector general. In addition, Chuck Grassley, Republican, wrote a letter that had bipartisan support. Dianne Feinstein and others signed the letter essentially saying, you know what, President Trump, please give us a reason for firing Mr. Atkinson that is within the scope of the statute. We created this independent watchdog, prior Congresses did, specifically to serve the American people because, you know, the sunlight is the best disinfectant. And the idea is if you don't have anything to hide, there shouldn't be a problem with having a neutral inspector general. And just to keep in mind, these inspectors general tend to go from president to president. They're not, unlike, say, cabinet officials, they don't turn over with each new political position, with new political person in the White House. They tend to be adhered to from administration to administration so that they can operate with a perceived independence and legitimacy. And of course, the presidents can do these kinds of things, but generally the backlash is political. We saw this when the president first took office and he fired FBI Director James Comey for political reasons, not illegal, not against the law, but there was political pushback at that point. And what we're seeing now, for lots of reasons, is a dilution in that level of oversight. It's becoming normalized to politicize the positions across the board in the executive branch. And again, then we're creating a new kind of government that will be handed off to the next president and the next president and the next president. And that is generally one with less oversight, less consequences for violating laws and norms. And at the end of the day, that's really not good for American democracy.
And Kim, the message that's being sent here, what do you think it is to people who might be in a position to be a whistleblower, or those people who are tasked with oversight of government? Is there anything, by the way, that Congress can do to help ensure that there are protections in place for people like that?
Yeah, so good question. So whistleblowers have actually been in place since the dawning of the Republic. One of the very early statutes when the first Congress passed was a whistleblower statute. So the framers of the Constitution, who were part of the first Congress, some of them, understood the importance of having whistleblowers, people inside government, be able to basically tell higher ups and the public when things are going wrong. And certainly the message here is there will be retaliation potentially, or at least if you want to blow the whistle, your voice will not be heard, because the people presumably that will be put in these positions, if Mr. Trump continues on this path, will be loyalists to Mr. Trump, people that are more likely to hide information about potential wrongdoing in the White House rather than share it, because if they share it, they will lose their job. So again, this is a shot across the bow, a message to not just whistleblowers, but to people in government, that if you want to keep your jobs, if you want to be part of the Trump administration and the federal government, your loyalty is to the man first, the rule of law, and the American people second. And of course, some people, myself included, the concern with that frame of government is it looks a lot like an unlimited monarchy and a lot less like an accountable government by, of course, quote, we the people, that's in the Constitution. The notion is we are our own government. We govern ourselves. It's not any one person who's entitled to power. And the way we ensure that the people who have the power of the people exercise it responsibly is to be able to vote. And we can't vote if we have no information on what's actually going on.
Finally, Kim, before we let you go, so last month Congress approved this $2 trillion coronavirus relief package. As you know, a lot of folks watching this right now, as we find ourselves working from home and hunkering down in the midst of this global pandemic, might wonder, well, the president says that these inspectors general, or he would suggest that there's political motivations. I wonder if you could help kind of draw the line. Why is someone like an inspector general overseeing a $2 trillion coronavirus relief package critical for Americans who right now are dealing with the very immediate kind of questions of survival? They may look at this and think, well, this sounds like a political kind of battle that doesn't really have anything to do with me. Help us understand the actual role of an inspector general with respect to, say, the coronavirus relief package. This is American taxpayer money we're talking about.
Right. So we have $2 trillion in funds, and the inspector general in this instance was given $80 billion to essentially function as an oversight mechanism, because we're all working under difficult conditions, and so is the federal government. It's a lot of money to be handed over. And it's essentially like an auditor, someone who stands essentially over the shoulder of the federal government to make sure that that money is used in a responsible way. So inspectors general tend to be able to hire their own people. They don't have to go through politicians. They often have subpoena power, so they can gather information independently to basically ensure, to connect the dots, to cross the T's, to dot the I's, to make sure that abuses aren't being effectuated with this very important money. For example, that the dollars are going for causes that actually function to keep Americans safe, to buy the products that are necessary to keep the health care professionals in the hospitals able to help Americans who are ill and dying. That's just one obvious example, and not sort of line pockets of their buddies or their pals or political donors, et cetera, that money, that valuable money that Americans are now struggling independently with losing their jobs, being laid off because of the coronavirus, that their precious taxpayer dollars, in addition to all of these things that are happening to Americans, aren't wasted and used in corrupt ways. That's the whole idea. Remember, inspectors general came out of a real crisis in American democracy. That was Watergate. And Congress decided across the board, multiple statutes, that, listen, we need oversight in place. We can't let this happen again. This is one example, and you ask me, what can Congress do? It looks like in this instance, Congress might need to amend these inspectors general statutes to put even tighter reins on the political ability to essentially fire people for doing their jobs. Now that gets into constitutional questions, because the president, as you mentioned, does have the ability to appoint and remove officers, but that's actually quite complicated. And the Supreme Court has justified limits on the president's ability to remove people precisely for this reason. The idea is Americans need people with science and integrity and those kinds of neutral, objective factors driving how they do their jobs, not so much worrying about getting rehired and keeping their jobs. This is exactly why, for example, federal judges can't be fired politically. They're there for life. It's same reason. The framers understood that if you're worrying about kind of getting axed at work, you might not do what's best for the American people and the rule of law. And the inspectors general are that same concept. And here, when this statute was passed so quickly, and it's so much money, and lives are at stake, it's absolutely vital that there be just basically a second pair of eyes that's not worrying about their political futures, to make sure that money is used in the way that Americans deserve it to be used.
All right, Kim Wehle for us. Kim, thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time to give us your analysis. Take care.
Thank you, Elaine.